So I'm like, yeah, come with me. So we walk across the parking lot, and the first thing they see is Travis Kelce shirtless, getting mauled by a fake bear, covered in honey. And they're like, oh, we're not in Kansas anymore.
You've got to come to a Ryder Cup, Michael. It's the best event in sports. Now, here am I, just a little programming nebbish, trying to tell the greatest basketball player and arguably one of the greatest athletes of our generation or any generation what the greatest event in sports was.
Hey again, everybody. Welcome to The Big Swing with Jimmy Roberts. That's, of course, me. We invite you to like, subscribe, and comment. And as we record this, now 850 days since the framework agreement between the LIV and PGA Tours. And apparently, they're exactly where they were on day one, which is basically nowhere. So stay tuned. Or not. And speaking of staying tuned, the ratings for the Ryder Cup are in. No surprise, what looked like it was going to be a runaway apparently put a damper on viewership. The bad news for NBC, this year the lowest Sunday ratings for a U.S. Ryder Cup this century. There was some good news, though. When the U.S. made its run, viewership spiked by more than 2 million. But in the end, like most sports, unless Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan are playing, it's really mostly about the same old story. How many people are watching is all about how good the game is. That's kind of sports media in a nutshell since the very start. Really hard to pin a date on the birth of golf media. From podcasts and TV and newsletters and movies, it's all over the place now. But it goes back a long way. Bobby Jones made newsreel films in the 30s. Herbert Warren Wind and Dan Jenkins and who knows how many other great writers gave us books and magazine pieces. And since the early 1950s, it's been on television. And now there are podcasts like this one and newsletters. However you like to consume it, golf has been around for a very long time. And the one thing that has been a constant about golf media is that it's changing all the time. Today, two of the most prominent figures responsible for how we consume the game. Jon Miller of NBC Sports, who's had a hand in some of the biggest deals with all of golf's biggest organizations over the past 30 years. And Chad Mumm, who sits on the vanguard of what's next in golf media. They represent different generations, but they are both smart and tireless and here with us today to talk about where we've been, where we are, and where we are heading. That's all coming up right after this. Okay, pleased to be joined now by one of the most powerful and influential members of the golf media. I don't even know how to describe him. He seems to have his fingers in everything. It's Chad Mumm. He was the producer of Full Swing, co-producer of Happy Gilmore 2, and now the chief executive of Pro Shop. Chad, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Jimmy.
All right, I'm not even sure where to start with you because there's like I said before, you got your fingers or have had your fingers in so much. But let's start where you are right now, and then we're going to work our way back. Let's start with Pro Shop. What exactly is Pro Shop?
Yep, Pro Shop is a holding company that's focused on the intersection of golf and pop culture. So it was started on the back of Full Swing. I created Full Swing. The idea for it, was 9 years in the making and took almost a full decade to pull all the rights and relationships together to then bring that show to Netflix and put it on the air. But after doing that, felt like I wasn't really done in golf. I'm a huge golf fan and a golfer myself. And so, I wanted to do more. I saw the rising tide of golf and popular culture. It just felt like everywhere you look, it was, golf on TV or a different celebrity or athlete picking up the clubs and starting to tweet or post about or on Instagram about their love of golf. You had this YouTube golf explosion that was kind of existing apart from pro golf. And it just felt like there was a bigger opportunity. And as I put Full Swing together, I got to build a bunch of great relationships across the entire ecosystem of pro golf, from the governing bodies to the PGA Tour to the players and their agents. And the more I understood the business of golf, it felt like there was a bit of a missing piece, thinking about this digital audience and this younger fan as they interact with the sport. And so much of the kind of core golf media ecosystem is really targeting that, like Peter Millar wearing, private club goer, top, key business decision makers, which is one of the reasons why, the industry of pro golf kind of punches above its weight in terms of its advertiser demand. It's a very valuable audience. But I think
it's over the demographic.
it's a great demographic. But over the last 5 years, you've seen this kind of grassroots consumer explosion in golf, and there really didn't feel like there was any sort of scaled entity kind of focusing on that. So we started Pro Shop with that in mind. The company is a partner of the PGA Tours. We have a digital rights deal with the PGA Tour that allows us to create content on site, to use their archive and highlights, and to try to use that to create media to appeal to this younger fan. And we now, we are, as I mentioned, we're a holding company. So we have sort of two core media assets within the family. So we have Scratch, which we acquired from the PGA Tour, sort of spun it out a year and a half ago, and have since relaunched it with a full editorial focus on kind of the lifestyle of golf. And then we recently acquired Golf WRX, which is if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably a golf fan, but it's a long, kind of a very healthy community of golf, real hardcore, I would call almost like prosumers, built around a community and forum around equipment and golf instruction. And Golf WRX is kind of one of the old OG digital golf media brands, and felt like one that in our hands could really be taken to the next level.
So is there a rock that you feel like you haven't turned over yet in terms of having found something?
Definitely more rocks to turn over, as always. I will say, one of our goals was, because we are a new company, we can be nimble, we can move fast. You know the business of golf. It's a small industry in some respects, and it's a very small group of people kind of running it. So we've always had this attitude of, if we can be a speedboat in a world full of cruise ships or aircraft carriers in some respects. And so I think our goal was always to kind of be able to take advantage of being a startup, being nimble, and turn over rocks faster than maybe the existing institutions on the media front in golf could do themselves. And we've always had this mantra at the company from the very beginning was, we don't want to become the thing we're trying to disrupt, but the ecosystem around the media industry in golf felt ripe for a new player with a focus more on consumers and this younger digital audience.
Yeah, that's tough to do, though, because that means that everything has to be original, right? It has to be a new original idea. It can't be just another iteration of what's out there.
I think it's also about voice. I think the voices, originality can come from a lot of different places. I think our focus has been on talent and voices. And so how do we identify the next generation voices, whether that's covering golf, pro golf, and Dan Rappaport, who we brought over from Barstool to host a new show called Dan on Golf that's distributed across Scratch, or that's people like Raymond Williams, whose Instagram channel Golf Projects follows golf fashion and the trends at kind of that intersection of golf and streetwear and culture. That's been our core focus, identifying that talent that can bring an originality in their voice to a space that already has a ton of coverage and a ton of attention. But as you know, talent is everything. I don't
know. How do you get from being a kid at the University of Georgia to being a co-producer of Happy Gilmore 2, to producing Full Swing? What was your path?
Yeah, I was a military brat growing up, which meant I didn't really have a hometown. I moved every few years, and for me, golf was always the one consistent thing, from place to place. And I always thought of the golf course as a home away from home. I'd move as a kid. Every Air Force, my dad was in the Air Force. Every Air Force base, the joke is kind of the first thing they build is the runway, then they build the golf course, then they build the rest of the base. So there's a strong kind of golf culture across the Air Force. In fact, my grandfather was also an Air Force pilot, and he was a colonel. He's the one who first got me interested in the game. He did an exchange tour with the Royal Air Force and was based at Lukers Air Force Base, which you might know is across the Firth of Forth from St. Andrews, and they used to do matches in the Officers Club versus the Royal and Ancient, back in the 50s and 60s. So golf's always been sort of a part of our family and a sort of part of that Air Force tradition. When I graduated, I went to the University of Georgia. My dad retired from the Air Force, moved to Atlanta. He was a pilot. I ended up going to the University of Georgia because there's this great sort of lottery-funded scholarship for state schools, and always had my eye on making it to LA or New York. I knew I wanted to be in the media business. I was a creative kid. I played sports. Yes, I played football and golf, but I also, was in a band and musical theater, and I always loved creating things and performing.
Wait, hold on. What instrument did you play?
Guitar and piano.
Nice.
Yeah.
Should have known.
My rock band days are over these, Jimmy, but I could still bring it out every once in a while.
What was the name of the band?
It was called One Way. So thank God there was no internet back then. So I don't think any of those videos have made it to the internet. This is
we'll look.
There's a lot of gray hair here, buddy. We missed that. But anyway, after college, when I was a senior in college, I interned at Turner for Cartoon Network, and that was my first experience sort of in the TV world. And I decided I wanted to go pursue a career in media. I really wanted to be a director. That felt like the best opportunity. I wanted to direct TV, which to me felt mass market, but also, there was an art form to it. So my first real job in media was I was a writer. So I got employed by a tech blog called Engadget that was covering, the explosion of kind of technology. This was that sort of Web 2.0 blogosphere. And eventually we started a show that for its time was extremely ambitious. It was called the Engadget Show. It was sort of the inside the actor studio for technology. Our first guest was Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft. Wow. We had a live studio audience. We did it at the Time Center in New York. That led to a relationship with Jim Bankoff, who was transitioning SB Nation into a media company that would become Vox Media, which is where I landed with that show and my little production company, and spent 10 years as the sort of chief creative officer at Vox. And so I got a up close and personal look at the digital transformation of the news and media industry, particularly on the sort of magazine and digital media front. I learned a ton about advertising and creating content, whether that's long form content, advertising content, short form written content, building YouTube channels, launching podcasts. And then in 2015, I decided that it was time to really pursue my dream of getting into the Hollywood business. So I think the deal was I had sort of 3 years, of like lifeline support and just go out and see what you can figure out. And 2 years to the day after moving to Los Angeles, we sold our first television series, and we sold like 4 more after that. And so that created Vox Media Studios, which I led from 2015 to 2023 or 24 when I left to start Pro Shop. And all the while I had this idea for a golf show percolating in the back of my mind. I ended up as executive producer of over 50 TV shows, across the premium television landscape, right at the perfect time as the streaming wars were booming. And Full Swing was this kind of ongoing white whale for me, where I had first met the PGA Tour executives in 2012 when they were looking for some help building out a digital media business. Ironically, the business that ended up being created out of those conversations was Scratch, although we didn't get that contract. So I had to watch someone else go and build that idea that we had sort of percolated with the tour. But that created a relationship with the media team there, particularly Chris Wandell, who now leads the media team and the advertising team over at the tour. And so, I'd see him every year at industry events or, at industry events. And I started pitching him on doing this doc series. And I think I first pitched him in 2016 when I had just moved to LA, and I was kind of a nobody producer. I didn't have any credits to my name. But by 2019, I probably had 25 credits, and they started to pay a little more attention. I think the big differentiator was, a new commissioner. So, it was always, if we were going to make a show about pro golf, we had to have it sort of be warts and all. That was our mantra with the tour. It couldn't be like sanitized. It couldn't feel like branded content. The players had to be able to cuss and show emotion and really feel like real human beings. And I don't think that was going to work in the Fincham era. But when Jay became commissioner, Jay Monahan, there was sort of new guard in town. I think they felt like they had an opportunity or an obligation to create a new batch of stars, kind of post-Tiger. They knew that wasn't going to last forever. And so there was a willingness to engage. And at this point, I think I maybe just pestered them for long enough that they thought, all right, well, let's give him a chance. So Full Swing was created on the golf course at Shadow Creek during CES. I went out with Chris and the PGA Tour media team. Over that 18 holes, we put together the founding deal that led to Full Swing. And 3 months later, I found myself at the Players Championship, shaking hands with the PGA Tour brass and had the exclusive rights to do a doc series on the PGA Tour. 2 years later, after getting Augusta and the rest of the governing bodies and signing 25 players, the show premiered on Netflix. So the one thing that I want to mention, we came out right after Drive to Survive, which I think had really created
the F1 show.
That's right. And that created an entirely new category of sports follow docs that really looked at the entire season. Historically you had your sort of 30 for 30s, your classic sports documentaries looking back on a moment in history in these historical docs. And then obviously Hard Knocks, I think, was probably the industry leader. And in fact, Hard Knocks was the core inspiration for Full Swing originally. What I loved about Hard Knocks was this notion that it was individual storylines, and I felt like that paralleled the life of a PGA Tour player. So originally, and I don't think I've ever actually said this before publicly, but the original idea for Full Swing was a 12-episode quick turn doc series that would shoot during the week of the PGA Tour events and then premiere the Wednesday before the first round of the next week's event.
Wow.
And so
That's
we had
ambitious.
It was, and we had a great team that was sort of built to do that. A bunch of ex Hard Knocks people had come together to do it, and the show was going to run from the Century, so obviously Kapalua, and conclude at the Players, because the PGA Tour could give me its rights, but once the majors started, we were on our own. While we were developing that project, so you got to go back to 2019. I get the rights in March, so at Players, March of 2019, I finally have the rights from the PGA Tour. We start to decide, are we going to go take this to market and try and sell it? Obviously, we weren't going to do it in 19, so we were sort of targeting beginning the show in 2020. I think you see where this is probably going.
Yep.
So the next step was to sign some players. And the PGA Tour, as you well know, and as listeners and viewers of your show, I'm sure know, they can't make their players do anything. So they basically said, look, we're willing to introduce you to some agents, but that's kind of about it. We need to be Switzerland here. We can't really play favorites. We can't ask on your behalf for players to participate. So they made a few intros, and I made a big spreadsheet. And my plan was to go to the Masters on a general admission ticket, stand outside the rope line of the big tree, and just flag down agents that I recognized with the photos I had printed out on my paper, because they didn't have our cell phones, at the Masters. Yep. And so I did that, and the first agent I met with was Jordan Spieth's agent, Jay Danzy. And he told me I was crazy, that nobody would ever sign up for it. But if they ever would, what they would need to see was X, Y, and Z. And he gave me a lot of great advice. And, the meetings I had led to a handful of conversations. The first player actually to commit was Justin Thomas. So big credit to JT for kind of jumping in. Our initial cast was JT, Tony Finau, and Cam Champ actually also said yes, that he had just come off of sort of 2 wins. And so then we entered into a conversation with, I felt like we needed at least 4 before we could take it to market. We were looking at who's the most marketable player not named Tiger Woods. There's one answer. It's Ricky Fowler. Yeah. So we started the conversation with Ricky, and that negotiation to kind of get him into the show took about 9 months. And so now we've got our sort of initial 4. It's fall of 2019, and we decide, okay, let's just wait and take this to market. Let's see if we could sign another 4 players. We're not going to be able to get this sold and up on its feet fast enough for the 2020 season. So let's just use that as a year to kind of continue to build some momentum and get this, in market in the summer of 2020. Now, the timing could not have been better, because obviously we all know what happens in March of 2020. The entire world shuts down for COVID. But in addition to that, about the same time, when the entire world is stuck indoors, Drive to Survive Season 2 premieres on Netflix and becomes a global hit. And now all of a sudden, Netflix is looking around for another sports doc that could follow in the vein of Drive to Survive. Our show is sitting right there, half built at this point.
And you've got the relationships with Netflix.
We've got the long relationships with Netflix, so we were trusted there. So that immediately became a real opportunity, and Netflix essentially said, we'll be interested in greenlighting this show, but it's got to be not quick turns. So we're going to do it like Drive to Survive. We're going to film for an entire year, and then we're going to release it all at once. We also need all the majors on board, and instead of 4 to 8 players, we need like 25. And they have this list of kind of ranked priority of players, and I think of the 30 people on their list, I had to get like 10 of this group of names that are all the sort of bold-faced names you would imagine: Rory, Tiger, Phil, Brooks Koepka, Jordan Spieth, all those guys. And so that began this process. I'll never forget sitting in my office in the middle of COVID, getting on a Zoom with Augusta National and just seeing a long conference table and the words Augusta National, beneath their little window. And
That's a little intimidating.
It was, and I'll say that, my fandom, and I think the fact that I had Georgia roots, and the fact that my pitch to them was not to do a better job of telling the story of the Masters than they ever could, because obviously I can't. But my pitch to them was, I want to tell the story of what it's like to be a player in the Masters. I want to take it from the player point of view. You guys are the best at telling the story of the tournament. There's no chance that we would ever do that better than you. But I'll have access to these guys for the entire year, and I can land what it feels like to be invited to the Masters, what it feels like to drive down Magnolia Lane, what it feels like to sign the book when you check in a way that, maybe even you couldn't, because I've been with them all year and I can show what it means to them. And then it was kind of about getting the last name of this list of pros. And I funny enough, ironically or not, the last person to say yes, it was not Jay. Actually, I think JT had convinced Jordan to do it, but it was actually Brooks Koepka who was the final player. And he had just, they'd been in the bubble all year, and he and his caddy had watched every episode of Drive Survive both seasons. And they were like, we're going to do this for our sport. Let's do it. And so Brooks was the last player to say yes. And he was actually the first player ever interviewed for the show. So just a real full circle there.
This thing goes into production. You are a top 10 show on Netflix. I know that you love golf. But the idea that it could extend the brand of golf beyond, was it beyond what you thought it could be?
Oh my God, yes. I think, this was a 9-year process. It first started in 2012 in that sort of first meeting with the tour. I had been through the ringer, getting this thing put together. And at that point, all I cared was that it just got made, period. That it got out there. I did it. I finished the drill. Like, it's on the internet. You can watch it on Netflix. I had no idea it was going to be such a big hit. I remember when we signed the deal with Netflix, they asked, because I had, I'm pitching. So I had all this great drama and high stakes and, the sexy world. And my pitch was really strong. And then finally they signed the deal and they said, okay, let's be honest. Like, where's the drama in pro golf? And I was like, well, there's some rules fiasco sometimes, and people play slow and they get annoyed, and, but there's really not that much drama. Of course, starting when we started.
Oh my goodness.
You couldn't pick a better year because I'll take it the second month of production. We're shooting, it's February. We're filming at the Genesis Invitational in Riviera. I am upstairs. It's a Tuesday. I'm upstairs in the press room, which is, by the way, one of the nicer press rooms across all the PGA Tour at the Riviera Clubhouse.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the entire room starts murmuring and looking at their phones. And that was the moment that Phil Mickelson's quotes from Alan Shipnuck had finally been surfaced about, the Saudi League. And this wasn't just a thing percolating in the background, but it was like a real thing happening. And so in real time, the first year that our cameras are in the locker room, you have this massive fracture of this really unique, almost high schoolish culture of pro golf. It is a very small world, and they, and so everybody is now looking across the locker room of are you with me? Are you against me? Are you on Team Live? Are you on Team Tour? It just fractured the locker room immediately. And it became this question of who's staying and who's going and who's lying and who's getting offers. And, there was jealousy and anger and conflict, just kind of all year, and it started with the first wave of defectors. And then obviously there was a group that left after the US Open. And then finally Cam Smith, kind of the final nail in the coffin for that year after winning the Open Championship at St. Andrews and, beating Rory. And probably the most heartbreaking atmosphere I've ever seen was sort of Rory's that Sunday at St. Andrews, and Rory, couldn't get it done, and Cam, won. I think that hurt worse. You felt it hurt worse than even Pinehurst or LACC, some of those heartbreaks for Rory that he's had. And then afterwards, you get Cam Smith now leaving to go to Live. So, we could not have picked a better year to start filming from a drama perspective. And then all of a sudden, golf, which was this kind of sleepy sport, was injected into the geopolitics and general sports. I mean, they're talking about it on SportsCenter, and you got Bill Simmons talking about it, and and it just created this perfect, I don't know, microcosm, not microcosm, but perfect environment.
Perfect storm is what it was.
Exactly.
A perfect storm.
Perfect storm of drama, and our show, very publicly was right in the middle of it, and we had players in the show that left while we were filming to go to live. Ian Poulter, Dustin Johnson, Brooks Koepka, probably most famously, he's the second episode. And so I think there was a lot of inherent curiosity about the show when it premiered eventually, the following year, but also it was a good show. We had like really good storylines and really good payoff. You had Matt Fitzpatrick winning a major, at Brookline where he'd won a US Amateur. Yeah, he won the US Open. You had Justin Thomas, surviving to win at Southern Hills, and this kind of contrast with Jordan Spieth, who was this kind of golden child. And you had Scottie Scheffler's breakthrough at the Masters at the same time that the ultimate major killer, Brooks Koepka, had sort of lost hope in his game. And then, a bunch of other great stories in between. And so I think we had a mix of like good storytelling. We had the right kind of interest because of the kind of intrigue around Live. Everybody kind of want to see the train wreck up close. And then I think beyond that, like the world itself is like pretty appealing to a non-hardcore sports fan. It was just an absolute home run, and the ratings really supported it. I think even Netflix was shocked at how big it was when it came out.
Listen, I want to get to Happy Gilmore 2 in a second, but I want to go back first. Are there lessons that can be learned from how you got to where you are from where you were? I mean, you were... you kind of came out of nowhere and kind of dug it out of the dirt.
Yeah.
What are the lessons to be learned for a young business person who's trying to do the same thing? You created something from nothing.
Well, thanks, Jimmy. I think I'll answer this in two ways. One, I think with golf, it was hugely beneficial that I was an outsider, but I was an outsider who authentically understood the game and understood the sport. And golf media, when I entered into it with Full Swing, was the same 200 people who'd been doing it for 20 years. And so, with a handful of like young, podcasts like No Laying Up and Shotgun Start and some new media people doing their thing. But it really helped that I wasn't of the system. And so and I think there's something to be learned from that and just sort of how you build relationships when you're new to something that then carry over kind of with the expectation that you're going to be there for a long time. So that was one thing I think that really mattered. I think in terms of the other piece of it is I've always thought about my career as not being particularly goal oriented, which I know is you go to you talk to a lot of business people and they've had these big goals their whole lives and, they want to be CEO of X and they work every day to get to that. I never really saw my path that way. I thought about it more as direction. So, to me, I saw where I wanted to be in my life and career as kind of like north. And to me, it was always about going north at all times. And I didn't, and what was north to me would change as my career evolved, but it was like, you're never going to actually get there. It's just, am I going north? And every once in a while I'd have some diversions and I'd have to reorient myself. Am I still going north or am I off, am I moving east now? And just try to nudge yourself back to going north. And so I like to think about it not as a goal, but as more of a general direction for building a career and building a life. And the other big important piece of advice I got was just to not try to skip the stairs. So, just the other analogy I use for thinking about my career is kind of climbing a staircase in a skyscraper. You really just need to step on every step. You can't jump stairs, otherwise you might trip. And sometimes you're climbing and sometimes you're on a landing and maybe you're making a turn, but there's another stair to step on and then you kind of keep going. And so I've always tried to appreciate stepping on every stair and being able to recognize how high you've climbed, but knowing that there's still 2,000 steps above you.
All right, let's talk for a minute about Happy Gilmore 2. I just don't know how to have a serious discussion with you about this because it just looks like it was probably so much fun. And everybody's probably got their favorite line from the original movie and from the sequel. For me, it was the great line with Travis Kelce, of all people, as the waiter, taking an order from Jack Nicklaus, who's in conversation, and he asks him if he'd like something to drink, and Jack says, "Yeah, I'll have an iced tea and a lemonade, please." And Travis Kelce says, "Oh, you mean Arnold Palmer?" And Jack says, "Oh, no, Jack Nicklaus, but I get that a lot." It was, and Jack was so great. I mean, he really, really carried it off, and you got to see a different side of a lot of people. First of all, how much fun was it to do this?
I mean, it was as fun as you could ever imagine, and everybody had a blast. I think if you talk to Jack or you talk to any of the players that made cameos, it was just an awesome time. You know, Sandler just does such a great job of making that movie set feel like a community and a home, and it really, by the way, it is. He has a lot of the same crew members and cast members that he's been working with for his entire career. So, you know, for 30 years, it felt like being on set every day. I'd see another person from Waterboy or Billy Madison pop up, and he's been using the same producers and crew kind of the entire time. So he's fiercely loyal to his people, and that comes across in the sort of family atmosphere. That one was a dream come true. I thought kind of Full Swing was the apex of my golf fandom, getting to do something in entertainment. I never thought I'd have a chance to be co-producer of Happy Gilmore 2, which was, you know, my favorite golf movie as a kid. And how that came about also was was an interesting story because
how did it happen?
So Adam had been, you know, sort of toying with the sequel since the first movie was made. I mean, they had been talking about it when it became a cult classic. You know, I think there was ideas for a sequel, and it took him sort of 30 years, him and Tim Herlihy, who's the writer, to kind of get the script in a place where they felt like it really made sense. And I think, you know, you see the movie, it's like him now kind of at his actual age, trying to take one more run at it to help save regular golf. So, you know, that timing really made sense. And then he had done a movie for Netflix called Hustle, which is a basketball film. It's an awesome sports movie. If you haven't seen it, it's a really, really good sports movie. And it had a ton of real basketball in it. And I think that more than any other sports movie, like all the basketball in Hustle is real basketball being played by real professional basketball players, full of real coaches and real agents. And the authenticity of the sports really comes through. And so he had sort of wanted to bring the same level of authenticity to Happy Gilmore 2 from a golf perspective. Now, obviously, it's a much more ridiculous kind of comedy. It's a madcap comedy, but he wanted it to be, you know, he wanted the events to feel and look and feel like real events. He wanted there to be real golfers in it. And so he was looking around for someone to kind of help bring the golf IQ of the movie up in terms of like delivering both a bunch of players, but also just making sure the golf felt really real. And so I interviewed for that job, you know, and Netflix was actually the ones who connected me with him. So, you know, their sports team was like, well, if you're looking to get golfier, like we have a golf show.
Makes
Here's
sense,
the
right?
executive producer. Yeah, you should go talk to this guy. And crazy enough, the first day that I met with them was the Friday at Valhalla where Scottie had been arrested. So that was the first day I met Tim Herlihy, who was out visiting. And so it was kind of a crazy day for him to be out there anyway. He's like, is everything on golf like this? You know, like you got Liv in season 1, you got Scottie being arrested. I was like, well, this is a unique day. And then I went out and met with Adam and ultimately, you know, kind of got invited to join the production. And I remember sitting in their office. The script was on massive lockdown. So, you know, I had to go read it in their office, and I'm sitting in the Happy Madison and I'm reading the script and I'm just taking notes. And he had said there was a few cameos in there. And as I get to the end, I had 32 names written down on my little notepad of people that I was going to have to go and get. And
Wow.
and I got to say, we got every single one of them except for one, and that was Tiger.
Right.
But it was amazing to to hear how excited all the players were to do it. And it was not a hard sell to say, hey, do you want to be in Happy Gilmore 2? You know, everybody loved that movie, especially this like era of player. They all grew up with it. They all wanted to be a part of it. What was a lot harder was, you know, the second part of that conversation, which is, okay, it's 11 days, you know, to filming. And these are athletes that are not used to doing anything more than a half day, even for a big national commercial. And so to go to Rory McIlroy's agent and say, I need him in New York for 10 days, you know, that was like, you got to be kidding me. But ultimately, you know, the players are the ones who said, look, I don't care what it takes. I want to do this.
They wanted to do it.
And I got to say, this was completely unplanned, but it only worked because of the schedule. And because of Adam's filming schedule with other projects, the entirety of the production had to take place basically from September to December, and which is the only time in the golf calendar where players are kind of not doing anything. It's like their only off time. And so it worked out where we could get those guys up to New Jersey. We filmed the whole, you know, all the golf.
Fiddler's Elbow, right?
Up at Fiddler's Elbow and a couple other places around New Jersey. And so we brought them all in. And the scene that you mentioned with Jack, that's our Champions Dinner scene. That was the toughest one to pull off because there was 12 different cameos in that one scene. It was a 2-day shoot. And I remember getting there, it was before dawn, 4:30 in the morning, and every guest cameo had their own star trailer. And I'm walking down the aisle of this, parking area, and it's like Jack Nicklaus, Sir Nick Faldo, Fred Couples, Lee Trevino, Corey Pavin, Keegan Bradley, Jordan Spieth, Ricky Fowler, Colin Morikawa, I forget who. Oh, Xander Schauffele.
Xander Schauffele. He was terrific.
Terrific. And that was the first day also that Travis Kelce was on set. And so I remember when Jordan and Ricky showed up with their wives at, probably 8 a.m., they're like, hey, can we go see the shoot? Like, what are you shooting? So I'm like, yeah, come with me. So we walk across the parking lot, and the first thing they see is Travis Kelce's shirtless getting mauled by a fake bear, covered in honey. And they're like, oh, we're not in Kansas anymore, are we? So, but they all did great and had a blast and were really, really funny. Honestly, I thought like Xander killed it, and Jack
terrific.
was great. Also like
Spieth was great too.
Spieth was great, and the fact that they, they made little jokes that played off of their persona. So, Jordan being this polite golden child, complaining about his gin and tonic order, like it's so fun. Having Ricky be the sort of that's what she said back and forth with Xander, who you'd never expect was awesome. And then, like guys like Will Zalatoris and Justin Thomas, who were there, a couple weeks before. I thought Will was incredible, and they all could really act and really deliver. And then we ended with the big four, which was, which was Brooks, Bryson, Rory, and Scottie. And one of my favorite memories from that shoot was, where they all stayed. So, we put them up in hotel rooms and obviously like travel them in, and they didn't get paid a lot. It was like basically a SAG like extra rate. So they weren't doing it for the money, but we were going to put them in nice places. And so I remember Rory stayed in the city at like a really nice hotel and had wanted to be in New York City because he was going to go do dinners and stuff afterwards. And Brooks Koepka wanted to be as close as possible to the filming location, but in a really nice place. So we rented him like a nice horse farm house, and he had like a chef and his family there, and not super surprising. And then Bryson stayed over at Trump Bedminster because he wanted to be able to produce content. So he thought he'd have access to a range, which I remember, I think the room was like $300 a night, which was hilarious. And I totally forgot where we stuck Scottie. And after the first day of filming with those four, I go back to the crew hotel, which is like a Hilton Garden Inn in Bedminster, New Jersey. And I'm exhausted but satisfied because we got them all there. And I'm walking in the lobby, and who's sitting there like eating a microwave burrito? Scottie Scheffler. So he was happy at the crew hotel. And I said, what are you doing here? He's like, listen, man, it's just a bed, like I figured we'd have early mornings and late nights. And so, just
Scottie.
It says enough about Scottie. He was just happy with the rest of the crew.
All right, listen, let me get you out of here on this one. And it's a simple question. Can golf on television survive?
Absolutely. I think all live sports can survive. I think live.
But how? How is the key?
I think the idea of continuing to think about the consumer product of that. I think if you look at the Masters, I think if you look at the Players Championship, limited commercials, epic storytelling, golf is fortunate that it's played at very beautiful locations. So it creates great scenery. I think the more that players can become characters in a wider drama, which Full Swing has done, I think, a good job of building up some of these players. But I think also the PGA Tour, needs to kind of build those characters and create rivalries and have good guys and bad guys and think about how to capture people's imaginations to have those things play out on the golf course. But yeah, I'm bullish on golf on TV. I think it's what's been interesting on a more macro sense is that golf, putting aside pro golf has gotten more popular than ever right now.
Right.
And a lot of that has been driven, usually, historically that's been driven by the pro game. So whether it's Francis Ouimet or Bobby Jones or Arnold Palmer or Tiger Woods, these big booms in participation for golf have kind of always been led by the top of the sport. We're in an era now where it's the opposite. The boom in golf is happening kind of grassroots. It's actually getting people out playing golf. It's actually being driven more by like LeBron James becoming obsessed with golf or Saquon Barkley becoming obsessed with golf than I think it is by, Scottie and Rory and the PGA Tour. What's interesting is you're finally seeing PGA Tour ratings, I think, catching up to this consumer wave of interest in golf. And I think that wave is not showing any signs of slowing down. And so I wouldn't expect the interest in the professional game to start slowing down either. And I do think that golf has a lot of good in terms of the tonnage, and its ability to put a product out there. But I think that, it has to be, I think Brian Rolup says this all the time. It's about competitive parity. It's about scarcity. And it's about making it feel simple. And I think like all great sports do that. The NFL does it the best. I think golf and the PGA Tour has an opportunity to do it. So I couldn't be more bullish. I'm sort of betting my career on it, Jimmy.
Man after my own heart. It's all about the stories. Chad Mumm, also the host, we should say, of Vanity Index, a great podcast. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Okay, so our next guest, this is almost cheating to actually talk to this man in a formal session. Jon Miller, everybody in the industry knows him because he's been around forever. Presently, his title, I think, is President of Acquisitions and Partnerships at NBC Sports, but he has touched everything in this game and knows just about everybody, including me, John. Can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Jimmy, or as I know you as J-Ro, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. I've enjoyed the big swing since you guys have launched, and I consider it a real honor and a treat to be a guest on the show. So happy to be here.
That's my man, just as scripted. All right, let's start with the Ryder Cup, which we're just coming off of. I'm not even sure where to start with. I know you're enormously proud of the relationship that you've engineered and taken great care with the PGA of America. But my goodness, last week, I don't even know what to say about it. It was embarrassing, I thought.
It was really rough because I think a lot of people predicted, some of the behavior when it was awarded to Bethpage. I don't think anybody ever anticipated it would sink to the level that it did, which was unfortunate. What's sad about it, the Ryder Cup has become such a great event. I actually think it's the best event in all of sports, and I've told that, and I still maintain that. And I hope that one hiccup or blemish doesn't affect that. The competition is great. The camaraderie is great. I always say that a European Ryder Cup is oftentimes a lot more fun than a U.S. Ryder Cup, largely because of the fans and the crowd. And a few bad apples, unfortunately, spoiled it for a lot of other people. The majority of the people who were there to enjoy the golf and enjoy the competition. But you had a few knuckleheads who probably were overserved and who felt that they had to make it about themselves and unfortunately diminished what was otherwise a terrific event on a spectacular venue. And so I hope that in retrospect, we look back on the 25 Ryder Cup at Bethpage and pull a couple of good things out of it. Number one, the U.S. made that amazing charge on Sunday where they only lost one match. I don't think any team has ever gone into a Sunday down as many points as they were. And number two, how well the Europeans played. I mean, people who want to take shots at the American team, I guess you can do that. But the fact of the matter is, the Europeans played great golf on Friday and Saturday. The Americans did not play badly. And it was a really exceptional display of great competition, some really good golf on arguably was one of the hardest courses, although the condition of the course wasn't as tough as other people remember it from either the 02 or 09 U.S. Opens. But it's still Bethpage. And you still have to perform under the glaring spotlight that is the Ryder Cup.
Yeah, one of the hardest golf courses I've ever played. Let's talk about what's next, because I think, listen, I've been to a bunch of Ryder Cups in Europe, as you obviously have as well. And I think the difference is the crowd has been raucous and I would say probably annoying, but I don't ever remember the line being crossed. Next time it's in Ireland, it's the 100th anniversary. Are you a little concerned about what this model might lead to?
I'm not. I think that a couple things. First of all, Adair Manor, which is going to be a spectacular venue in 27. I think that, quite honestly, one of the things that I was disappointed in, I was disappointed a little bit that we didn't, get out in front of it. I would have thought the PGA of America, possibly Keegan Bradley, would have basically said to the crowds, hey, let's be good hosts and not encourage this kind of behavior. And quite honestly, I think in Europe, whether it's Luke Donald or whether it's Justin Rose or whoever becomes the captain, they become the face and the voice of that Ryder Cup. And I think, knowing Luke Donald as we all do, and also Guy Kinnings and the European PGA, they will make it a point to make sure that the fans are more, I don't want to say subdued, because they're certainly not subdued, but they're not going to reach the levels that they do here. That kind of behavior, you might see it at a soccer game a long time ago, but you don't even see that kind of behavior anymore at a Premier League game or a Champions League game. So I don't think you're going to see that in Ireland. And when it comes back here in 29 at Hazeltine, I think that Minnesota, there's that expression, Minnesota nice. I think that the folks in Minnesota are going to want to go out of their way to prove that they are respectful, good fans, and you won't see this kind of behavior there either. I really hope and think that the Bethpage crowd was an anomaly, and we're not going to see that going forward. And I know that the PGA of America has been properly and appropriately. Derek Sprague came out and made some really good comments last week where he realized that they should have done more. And so I think we'll see a different approach going forward.
You think Bethpage as a site was a mistake?
No, I don't think it was a mistake. I think it's a great venue. I think that not enough was done to make sure that the crowd didn't behave this way. And it's tough, with this many people out there to do that. One of the things that I noticed on Saturday, I was out on the 6th hole, and I heard some things that were so vile, and you can't repeat them. But I noticed that people...
Well, actually, you could hear, but we won't.
But I noticed that people in the crowd, there was a lot of self-policing, that the fans in the crowd immediately pointed to the people who were misbehaving and saying comments to Shane and Rory on that 6th green, and security came and appropriately removed them from the grounds. I think that some people even took pictures, and you know what happens when they post a picture on social media now from someone. So I think that kind of behavior is just unacceptable. And I'm hoping that we've seen it once and never again.
The Ryder Cup has an amazing history in so many ways, but the thing that I can't get over is that this thing almost went out of business. And it wasn't that long ago. We talked about it with Guy Kinnings on the last podcast that we did. They lost their sponsorship in the early 80s, but in the early 90s, you were right there at ground level when this thing almost went away. I love that story. I've told it a million times about Kiwa. Tell it again.
So this is a great story, and really the credit for the Ryder Cup coming to NBC belongs with Ken Shanzer, who was the executive vice president of NBC Sports and was my boss at the time. Earlier in 1989, 1990, we had lost Major League Baseball. And Ken was very aware of the Ryder Cup, as was I. And the Ryder Cup, up until that point, had been on tape, on cable, and on a 1-week delay. You were lucky if you saw highlights on ABC's Wide World of Sports of it taking place at Muirfield or the Belfry or whatever. And so we had lost baseball, and Kenny went out and engineered a deal, and we brought the Ryder Cup to NBC. But we didn't have any money to pay a rights fee. We had a new boss in Dick Ebersol, and he charged us with filling 32 weeks of baseball programming, but we had no money to spend. So we went out and identified 2 sponsors, Cadillac and IBM, who were also the sponsors of the Masters. And they were going to be the 2 exclusive advertisers in the Ryder Cup. And we made that deal in January of 1990, shortly after we acquired the Ryder Cup. And basically, they were going to pay us $2 million each. We were going to pay the PGA of America $2 million. It was going to cost us about $1 million to produce the event. And if all went well, we'd make $1 million for NBC. So everybody was happy. We were going to put 3 hours a day, Saturday and Sunday, live on NBC from Kiowa, and USA Network was going to do some early morning coverage on Saturday and Sunday, and they were going to do Friday coverage. And all was well and good until the fall of 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and America went to war with Operation Desert Storm. And as a result, if you remember, in 1991, the bottom fell out of the television marketplace, specifically the golf and sports marketplace. So in May of 1991, both IBM and Cadillac pulled out of their deals for the Ryder Cup. And in those days, a lot of this business was done on a handshake. I mean, there was paperwork, but they were both big NBC advertisers, and they both pulled out. And we were not going to sue two of our biggest advertisers.
Right.
So we had to go in and tell Dick that we had lost our sponsors. And Dick said, well, then you got to get out of the deal. And we basically said to him, Dick, the Ryder Cup is 4 months away. We can't get out of the deal. He said, well, this is your deal. You better go out and sell it. So we went out and tried to sell it. I think Subaru was our official automotive. Long and short of it is we lost our shirts on that 91 Ryder Cup. So we go to Kiowa in September of 91, and on Friday, the U.S. gets waxed. They're down 6-2 after Friday's matches, and there was a lot of controversy and a lot of on-course shenanigans between Seve and Paul A. I mean, there was just a lot of stuff going on. Remember, there was the one ball rule. There were all kinds of issues that went on, coughing in guys' backswings. I mean, you name it. It had a lot of drama. But Saturday morning at 7 o'clock, I get a phone call from Kerry Haig telling me that there's fog and that they're not going to be able to start the foursomes at 8 o'clock, but they're going to be delayed till 9:30 or 10 o'clock.
Wait, let's just interrupt for 1 second and let people know and remind them that Kerry Haig, of course, is the I don't know what his title was back in 91, but he basically runs the Ryder Cup competition.
And he still does a tremendous job of it. He's really an exceptional event, chairman, organizer, whatever. Anyhow, so he called me and said, we're not going to be able to start till 10 o'clock. So what that meant was that we were not going to be able to finish the coverage on NBC because we were scheduled to go off at 6 o'clock. So at 5:30, the U.S. is making a furious charge back, and all four matches are still on the front nine. So I called Dick Ebersol. There were no cell phones available in 1991. And I explained to him that, Dick, we're not going to be finished by 6 o'clock. All four U.S. matches are still on the golf course. Dick was not a golfer and was already frustrated because this event was going to lose a lot of money. So after a couple of choice words, basically, I told him we have to stay on the air. He said, well, don't run any commercials. I said, well, you don't have to worry about that because we really haven't sold any commercials. Stayed on the air till dark, which was about 10 minutes of 8 at Kiowa. And the U.S. came all the way back and tied the matches at 8. So now we're going into Sunday singles, which we're going to start at 10 o'clock. We had the AFC football package at that time with the NFL, and the NFL had given us a clear out so that all of our games were going to be at 4 o'clock that afternoon. So the singles was scheduled to go from 10 to 6. And at 9:30, I'm in the production compound, and our production manager comes out and says, Dick Ebersol's on the phone. He wants to talk to you right away. And I'm thinking, boy, what else? Am I going to get fired before they singles? What else is going to happen? And I get on the phone, and he said, did you get out of the 93 Ryder Cup? Because we had strict instructions to get out of that second Ryder Cup. And I said, no, Dick, we haven't had that conversation yet. We were going to wait until after the Ryder Cup to address it. We're just focused on getting through this weekend. He said, well, don't get out of it. I just got a phone call from Jack Welch, who was the chairman and CEO of General Electric, who owned NBC, who told Dick that the Ryder Cup was the greatest event he had ever watched. He loved it. He loved every minute of it. He had canceled his Sunday morning golf game to stay home and watch. And to make sure we never lost the Ryder Cup as long as he was overseeing NBC. So obviously that afternoon was a very compelling day. There's the Mark Calcavecchia, Colin Montgomery match. There's the longer Hale Irwin match. The U.S. ends up winning the Ryder Cup at Kiowa. Dave Stockton was a tremendous captain. And the rest, as they say, is history. And we now have the Ryder Cup after doing 3 more extensions. The last one I did with Pete Bavacqua in 2013. We have the Ryder Cup through 2031. So I'm very proud of what it's become. You know, Tommy Roy and his team, along with Tom Randolph and the talent team that we have done an amazing job of elevating the event to really what it is, which is more than just a golf event. It's just a great sporting event, and it's become a great cultural event as well.
Yeah, you know, another funny element here, and we've talked about this before as well, is that in 1968, the Ryder Cup was actually owned by the PGA Tour, and they chose to give it up and just give it to the PGA of America. And instead, they chose to keep the World Series of Golf, which doesn't even exist anymore.
Correct. And that was, you know, that's that and selling the Allen event in Manhattan for $24 are two of the great trades that have happened in history. But you're right. Dean Beeman chose to give up the Ryder Cup to the PGA of America. And, you know, all credit to Joe Steranka and Jim Autry, and then, you know, obviously Seth Waugh and Pete Bavacqua and now Derek Sprague, some really remarkable men who have put forth great effort on the U.S.'s side, and then Guy Kinnings over on the European PGA, and George O'Grady and Ken Schofield before him have all been great partners of ours, and so we've really enjoyed this relationship.
You are a true relationships guy. You got every single one of those names. You are also, and you may or may not know this, behind your back you're referred to as the hardest working man in rock and roll. This is the guy who created the American Century Championship, among other things. But you're the guy responsible for making Charles Barkley a golf icon, I should say. How in the world did this happen?
Well, you know, Charles is really a remarkable character, and what you see is what you get. He is as genuine a person as you could ever want to meet. And he started coming to the American Century when it was the Isuzu back in the early 90s. Again, another property that we created once we lost Major League Baseball. Started coming and has come every year and doesn't miss it, including several years ago where he had two bad hips and he was scheduled to go in for hip surgery, and he postponed his hip surgery because he didn't want to miss the American Century Championship. He walked all 18 holes, all 3 days, even though he was offered a cart. He went through all of the criticism and ridicule and tough times with the hitch in his swing. He's now got that corrected. He's playing great golf. He's, you know, scoring incredibly well. He loves the game, but more than anything, he loves the people, and the people of Lake Tahoe love him. So much so that when they had those fires, probably now 10 years ago, very quietly, he wrote a significant six-figure check to the first responders and the folks of Lake Tahoe, as well as throwing a party on his own nickel for all the first responders and their families. There are not many people in sports like Charles Barkley, and he's a national treasure, and I'm thrilled that he comes to Tahoe every year. I tell people that we may lose Justin Timberlake, we may lose all kinds of stars one year to the next, but the biggest star we have out there is Charles Barkley.
Yeah, they really do love him out there. It's an extraordinary event. Are you a little bit surprised that it's lasted this long and been able to maintain the popularity that it has?
When we started this event in 1990, we had 3,500 people show up. We actually had a guy with a sandwich board out on the corner of Highway 50 north of the club trying to recruit people to come down to watch. This year, we had over 100,000 people. We have 80 or so players who play. We probably have 75 players on what we call a backup list. It's never an easy decision. Sometimes when you have to make cuts, we try to bring 10 to 12 new players in every year, which means 10 to 12 players have to stay home. But I'm really proud of it. It's become another event that, you know, is on people's calendars. You know, Jimmy, what's funny about golf is that there are only a handful of tournaments that are played on the same course every year. Obviously, Pebble Beach, Augusta, the American Century Championship. But, you know, other big events, they rotate. You know, the Open Championship rotates around. The U.S. Open rotates around. The PGA Championship plays different courses every year. The Players Championship is obviously at TPC Sawgrass. But there are very few courses where people really kind of get to know the holes. They know the scene on 17 with the boats, is really a spectacle. So and it comes at a time in the summer when you can get the NFL players, the NBA players, NHL stars. So you get a good collection of name brands out there, which makes it fun.
Yeah, it's really something special. Are you comfortable if I call you old school?
Not at all.
So if you're old school, tell me what you think of new school when it comes to golf. Because golf now, in terms of the media, is not anything like it was even, let's say, 15 years ago.
Well, I think that the golf has been a little bit slow to change, but they've made some good changes, and I think they're embracing, a bigger, wider audience. They've expanded their reach to include kids. You've got more women playing golf. I think, technology has made the sport a lot more accessible to people. I think things like, Pop Shot and Top Golf are good things for people. I think getting access to players, miking up players, some of the things that Tommy Roy has done in his broadcast had brought the game closer to people. I'm a big fan that the game is continuing to grow and improve and embrace new audiences, and I'm really excited about Brian Rolap, who's coming on to take over for Jay Monahan, who was a great friend and I think did a good job. But I think Brian brings the NFL mentality and some really interesting concepts and ideas to the PGA Tour, and I think that's going to be exciting as well.
Can golf survive on conventional TV? I don't think there's anybody who's kind of more deeply dug into the facts on this than you are.
I think they're smart, that they understand the value of what we call linear versus digital television. And I think that, people continue to watch. Look, the audience is still an older, affluent audience that still embraces linear television. We just did a 6-year extension with the USGA, which continues to keep the U.S. Open and the U.S. Women's Open on traditional television, obviously the Golf Channel. So I think it can continue, and I think it will continue to thrive, and I think there's enough support out there from sponsors who activate against the game and from the governing bodies to keep it front and center and to help grow the game. So yeah, I do think it can. I think it can exist, and I think it can thrive.
Do you? You think it can thrive? I mean, because let me just play devil's advocate for a second here. We talked a moment ago about, where golf is now culturally. We talk about social media. One of the biggest complaints that you hear on social media is that, there are too many commercials on golf on TV. My position would be, well, somebody's got to pay for it. Right. But, it hasn't quieted the chorus.
No.
How do you feel about that?
I think that's right. Look, putting on an event like the Ryder Cup, what we just did, it's like covering 18 different, events. You have a full collection of cameras on the tee box, in the fairway, on the green. Then you have the traveling cameras that are going with the walkers. I mean, it is an enormously expensive and difficult event to produce that costs a lot of money. You have to recoup that investment. I mean, this is not it's not
a public service.
Exactly. And fortunately for us, there have been some advances in the way golf is covered, where you do a commercial-free hour like we did on Sunday, or you do the side-by-side. So it's called playing through, which is a concept that we pioneered at NBC and that, we've used extensively for both the PGA Tour and the USGA and obviously the Ryder Cup. So that you can have a commercial up there, but also see what's going on. I know I get frustrated watching it as well. You get into it and it doesn't lend itself as well as sports like football or baseball or even the NBA to natural breaks. That's not golf. Right. And so you've got to find a way to cover your costs and cover your investment. And we're constantly working with the governing bodies, with the PGA, the USGA, and certainly the PGA Tour to try to make it as unobtrusive as possible, but it's still, the commercials are going to be there.
If you're the commissioner of all of golf, what's one thing you change to make it better?
I think scarcity. There's real value in scarcity, and what I mean by that is that there's golf on every weekend, and sometimes the fields are not the best fields, and they're not stars. And I realize that the tour, while on the one hand wants to provide playing opportunities, but I think as evidenced by things like the Ryder Cup or the U.S. Open or the Masters, people want to see the best players playing. And so I think if there's a way to do something with the game where you could put the best players out there on a more regular basis, I think that's going to be good for golf. And I also think you want to see them playing the best courses. I loved watching the Walker Cup from Cyprus. Cyprus is a course you rarely ever see, if ever. And I credit the USGA for putting the Walker Cup there. When they put the Walker Cup at Nationals several years ago, or the Pine Valley, I think people want to see events played on the best courses. So I think if we can find a flight to quality on courses and on fields, that's going to help grow the game as well.
John, you talk about scarcity, and I think, as strange as this is going to sound, you might be able to lay all of this at the feet of Tiger Woods, because when Tiger was so enormously successful, I think what the PGA Tour did was they decided, let's get on television every possible opportunity, because every time he's out there, tons and tons of people are watching. Well, Tiger Woods was Halley's Comet.
Right.
And, when he's not in the field, what you ended up with was, golf becoming basically what tennis has become. Too much, all over the place, and so people turn away.
Well, I will tell you, when I first got into the business and got into the sports business, there was 100 college basketball games available on television. That was it. 100 college basketball games. Last year, I believe there were 4,400 college basketball games available to either watch or stream, linear, cable, direct to consumer, however you want to put it. College basketball is a great sport, but it's everywhere, and it loses its specialness. And what concerns me a little bit is just to have a golf tournament on every weekend, but not to have players, and these guys are all great golfers. I don't want to take anything away from the quality of play, but I think that people tend to watch stars. NASCAR is an unbelievable sport. They do 39 cup races every year. Every one of their stars is on the grid for those races. Every one of those stars is on the grid for those 39 races. And I think when you're a NASCAR fan, you're going to see Chase Elliott. You're going to see Joey Logano. When Dale Earnhardt Jr. ran, you knew you were going to see Dale Earnhardt Jr. And I think knowing that your stars are going to be out there is really important. So I think that's one of the things that we have to look forward to.
Yeah, you talk about scarcity, and it's basically basic economic theory. If you want to make something more valuable, you don't make more of it, you make less of it, right?
You make less of it, you make it more valuable. So you asked me I've got two favorite golf stories.
Okay, I'm glad I knew if I gave you a moment, you'd be able to come up with it.
So it relates to it started off in Tahoe. So Michael Jordan, as you all know, is a huge Ryder Cup fan. I mean, he loves this event. And when Michael first came to Lake Tahoe and played in the Celebrity, I would tell him after the 91, 93, and 95 Ryder Cups, you've got to come to a Ryder Cup, Michael. It's the best event in sports. Now, here am I, just a little programming nebbish, trying to tell the greatest basketball player and arguably one of the greatest athletes of our generation or any generation what the greatest event in sports was. And he would look at me and just kind of laugh. And I would say, really, until you do it, you got to see it. So in 1997, the Ryder Cup was in Valderrama.
That's right.
And on Friday evening, after play, I got a phone call. And it's an unknown number, and I'm over in Spain. And I answered the phone, and it's Michael. And he said, I'm over in Spain on vacation, and I know the Ryder Cup is going on in Spain, and Gatorade has given me use of a helicopter. If I came over, could you get me in? Stupid question, right? Could I get you in? I said, of course we'd get you in. So he says, okay, I'm going to come over tomorrow morning. Can you pick me up? And I said, yeah, we'll have someone come pick you up. So he landed just outside of Valderrama. We had a car come pick him up. We snuck him in through the NBC catering tent. He immediately goes out on the course, jumps on Tom Kite's cart. The U.S. had been losing. He's there. He gets Tiger fired up. He gets all the team fired up. They end up taking the lead after Saturday's play, and then he obviously had to leave and go back. They ended up losing that Ryder Cup, but when he left that Saturday night, he looked at me and he said, "You were right. This is the greatest event I've ever been to. I'm never missing another one." And sure enough, he now makes it his point. He makes it his business to come. He brings a bunch of guys. He came this year. Yeah. He watched all day, every day, and loved every minute of it. And so he's been America's biggest cheerleader. I know he knows the guys on both sides, but he is clearly red, white, and blue all the way and loves the event. And I'm gonna cheat here. I'm gonna tell you a second favorite story because it involves somebody who you and I have an unbelievable amount of affection for and who we miss terribly. And it was the most important influence in my golf life, and that's Arnold Palmer.
Oh, yeah.
In 1994, Alistair Johnston and I came up with this idea to create a father-son golf tournament because we knew that Lee Trevino and Arnold and Jack and Gary weren't playing competitive golf anymore, and people still wanted to see them, and we still thought it was important that they see them. So we came up with this event, which Arnold felt, as you know, was the most important event in golf after the Masters and the U.S. Open. He thought the father-son, because of what it represented and how important golf was and how that legacy gets passed down from one generation to another. So in 2008, we had lost our title sponsor. We had gone into a recession, and we went 3 years without a title sponsor. And every year when we would go down and do the Bay Hill tournament, and we would sit in Lexington Cottage, and you would sit there and do your great interviews with Arnold every year, he would always give me a hard time about how come we hadn't found a title sponsor for the father-son. And it was somewhat embarrassing for me, first of all, because I believed it was a great event and we couldn't find anybody, but to get yelled at by Arnold Palmer is never a fun thing. And in 2011, we're at the Bay Hill Invitational, and Jim Rohr, who was at the time the chairman of PNC, happened to be in the Lexington Cottage paying Arnold a visit. And Arnold starts giving me a hard time, and he immediately pivots and he turns to Jim Rohr and he says, "You know what, Jim? PNC is going to become the new sponsor of the father-son." And Jim Rohr kind of looks up and goes, "What?" And he says, "Yeah, you guys are going to step in and become the sponsor of this event. It's the most important event in golf." And Jim Rohr looks at me and I said, we'll figure out a way to work something out. And that was, 15 years ago. And PNC, it's now the PNC Championship. They're an unbelievably great partner for this event, much like American Century is. And it all came out of Arnold yelling at me and then basically turning around and yelling at Jim Rohr. So those are two of my favorite golf stories.
Arnold loved to play in that event with his grandson, Sam
man.
Saunders. He really, really was quite fond of that. So listen, the last, I don't know, however long it was, 45 minutes, half hour, has been ample proof that if you should ever wander into a bar and there's an empty seat next to Jon Miller, you want to take it, but be prepared to stay a while. John, can't thank you enough for spending the time with us.
Thanks, Jimmy. It was my treat and my pleasure. Good luck with Big Swing. It's great.
The Big Swing with Jimmy Roberts is executive produced by Adrian Gallagher and Jimmy Roberts, produced by Alex Resnick, and edited by Sarah Chubnick. The show is a production of Big Swing Media. Fred Buescher, CEO, Jimmy Roberts, Chief Content Officer, Spence Kramer, Chief Operating Officer. Special thanks to Gil Capps, Jackson Roberts, Matt Casey, Frankie Brescia, and Jack Joyner.